Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are diving into Lauren Zander's. Maybe it's you today.
Oh, a great choice.
Yeah. This book, it really grabbed me. It's so direct and bold about how to approach personal growth.
I agree. So many self-help books kind of dance around the tough stuff, but Zander, she just dives right in.
Yeah, she does. No sugarcoating, no kidding around. It's all about really taking a look in the mirror and figuring out how to become the best version of ourselves.
It's refreshing, and what's great is she doesn't just point fingers. She gives you a real framework to work with.
Right. And the first step in that framework is, well, it's kind of overwhelming at first, to be honest.
I can see how it could be. What do you mean?
Well, she's all about dreaming big, right? But not just any dreaming. It's like dreaming in 12 different areas of life.
12. Yeah, that's a lot to think about.
Right. It's everything. Your body, your love life, career, money, you name it. She wants you to dream big about it.
Makes sense, though, right? If you're trying to really improve your life, well, you got to look at every part of it.
Exactly. And her argument, which I found really interesting, is that these areas are all connected. It's like if you're neglecting one area, even if it's just one, it can mess up your whole balance.
Oh, I totally get that. It's like a wobbly table, If one leg is shorter than the others, the whole thing is going to be off.
Exactly. It's not enough to just focus on work or just on your relationships. You got to address all of it.
So true. You were saying in your notes that you're feeling a little stuck lately.
Yeah, a little bit.
Maybe thinking about those 12 areas could help, see what might be throwing things off.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
And she doesn't want you to just be vague about those dreams either.
Yeah, she's all about specifics, isn't she?
Totally. She really pushes you to get crystal clear about what you really want.
That makes sense, though. How can you achieve something if you don't even know what it looks like?
Right. It reminded me of this anecdote she shares about a woman named Donna. She's a mother of 3. And she really struggled to explain what her ideal marriage would be like.
Interesting. Why do you think that was?
Well, Zander's point is that we often just avoid that deep level of thinking, even when it comes to our dreams.
We get comfortable with what is, even if it's not what we truly want.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of leads into, well, maybe the most important concept in the whole book.
Maybe it's you.
Yes, that phrase. At first, I have to admit, I was a little taken aback by it.
I bet. It's pretty confrontational, right?
It is. My first thought was, wait a minute, are you blaming me for everything?
It definitely sounds like that on the surface.
But as I kept reading, I realized it's not about blame at all. It's actually about, it's about empowerment, I think.
How so?
Well, because if you are the common denominator in all the things that aren't working in your life, well, then you also have the power to change them.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's like taking ownership.
Exactly. Yeah. Instead of feeling like a victim of your circumstances, you realize you have more control than you think.
It's a shifting perspective for sure. And Zander talks about how we often fall into this trap of just describing our life without taking any responsibility.
Oh, yeah.
She calls it being a weather reporter.
Yeah. It's so true.
Just stating the facts, oh, it's raining, but not acknowledging that you chose to go outside without an umbrella.
I do that all the time. Oh, I'm just bad with money, or I'm just not a morning person.
As if those are just facts of life, unchangeable things.
Right. Instead of saying, well, maybe if I created a budget and stuck to it.
Or maybe if I went to bed earlier.
Yeah. But it's so easy to fall into that trap.
It is. And that's what Zander wants us to break free from. She uses the example of Katie, the screenwriter who's struggling with her weight.
Oh, right, Katie.
She has all these explanations for why she can't lose weight, right? Her metabolism, her family history, hormones.
But really, as Zander points out, it's all just ways to avoid taking responsibility for her actions, her choices.
It's easier to blame external factors than to look inward.
It's funny. I see that in my own life, too, especially when it comes to, mention a specific challenge the listener has shared.
We all do it. It's human nature to try to protect ourselves from feeling, inadequate or we've failed.
And that's why I think Zander's message is so important. It's about saying, hey, it's okay to own up to our mistakes, to acknowledge our role in creating the situations we're in.
Because once you do that, you can actually start to change them.
Exactly. And she has this really interesting strategy for doing just that. It involves making promises to ourselves, but with a twist.
Promises. Tell me more.
So you make a promise, right? I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week, or I'm going to finish that project by Friday. But then here's the key. You attach a consequence to it.
A consequence? Like a punishment.
Not necessarily a punishment, but something that will motivate you to keep your promise.
Oh, I get it. Like a reward if you do it, or something you really don't want to happen if you don't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Zander actually shares her own example in the book. She made a promise to herself to have sex with her husband twice a week.
Wow. That's pretty personal.
It is. But it shows how serious she is about this. And her consequence was that if she didn't keep her promise, she would have to forfeit a day of coaching and painting.
Those are two things she clearly loves, so that would definitely be motivating.
Right. It has to be something that really matters to you. Otherwise, it won't be enough to keep you on track.
Makes sense. It's like finding the right leverage point.
Exactly. And it brings up another important point, which is, finding an accountability partner.
Oh, yeah. Someone to help you stay on track.
It can be so helpful to have someone to share your goals with, someone who can support you and, maybe even offer a little tough love when you need it.
It's like having a cheerleader in your corner, someone who believes in you even when you're doubting yourself.
Right. And speaking of doubts, that's another thing that Zander dives deep into, the power of our inner dialogue, how much our thoughts can affect everything.
It's amazing how much our own minds can hold us back, right?
It really is. And she talks about how we often have these negative beliefs and limiting theories that just sabotage our efforts.
Like those voices that tell us, you're not good enough or you're going to fail.
Yeah. It's like there's a little saboteur living inside our heads.
She calls it the double agent, which I think is such a great term.
It is. And sometimes it feels like that voice is on a loudspeaker,
Oh, totally. But the good news is Zander provides some really effective tools for dealing with it.
Like what?
Well, one of them is keeping a thought log, just writing down those negative thoughts as they come up.
Just noticing them without judgment.
Exactly, because often just bringing those thoughts into the light, making them conscious, can help to lessen their power.
It's like shining a light on the monster under the bed. Suddenly it's not so scary anymore.
Exactly. And once you start to see those patterns, you can begin to challenge them.
Argue back with the double agent.
Exactly. Zander calls it talk back. It's about offering evidence to the contrary, reminding yourself of your strengths and your past successes.
So instead of letting that voice tell you you're going to fail, you can say, wait a minute, I've succeeded at this before. I have the skills and the resources to make this happen.
Exactly. It's like retraining your brain to think more positively.
It's something I've been trying to do more of lately, especially when I notice that negative voice creeping in when I mention a specific example related to the listener's situation or goals.
It's a practice for sure, but the more you do it, the easier it gets.
But it's not just our own thoughts that can hold us back, right? Zander also talks about the influence of our family, our upbringing.
Oh, absolutely. It's like we inherit this invisible baggage from our parents, whether we realize it or not.
It's their relationship patterns, their money habits, their coping mechanisms.
And sometimes we end up repeating those same patterns in our own lives, even if they're not healthy for us.
It's like we're unconsciously trying to recreate that familiar dynamic, even if it's dysfunctional.
Exactly. And Zander uses the example of Donna again, the woman who is struggling to define her ideal marriage.
Right. And it turns out that her father was an alcoholic who hid his drinking, and her mother used shopping as a way to cope with the stress.
So Donna, without even realizing it, had adopted both of those patterns. She was overspending and hiding purchases.
It's amazing how those unspoken legacies can play out in our lives.
It is. And the first step to breaking free is just acknowledging that they exist.
Recognizing those influences and deciding which ones we want to keep and which ones we want to leave behind.
It's powerful, isn't it, to realize that we have a choice in how those patterns show up in our lives.
It means we're not just victims of our past.
Yeah.
We have the power to shape our own future.
Absolutely. And that's what personal growth is all about, isn't it? Taking control of our lives and creating the reality we want.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key concept that Zander talks about, owning our freak flags.
Oh, that's one of my favorites.
It's such a fun idea, right? It's about embracing those parts of ourselves that make us unique, maybe a little bit weird, but ultimately, what make us who we are.
The things that make us stand out from the crowd instead of trying to blend in.
Exactly.
Yep.
And Zander argues that it's in those moments of embracing our true selves, even the parts we might feel self-conscious about, that we really shine.
Because it's authentic, it's real, and people are drawn to that.
She shares this funny story about how she had feathers put in her hair for a festival, and then she realized she had a fancy dinner party to go to that night with people she didn't know.
Oh, I remember that story.
She was worried about what people would think, but instead of taking the feathers out, she decided to just own it.
Yeah.
And people loved it. They were drawn to her confidence and her willingness to be herself.
That's such a great example of how trying to fit in or be someone we're not ultimately backfires.
It's when we let our freak flags fly that we truly connect with others.
It's like giving others permission to do the same, to be themselves, unapologetically.
It's a beautiful thing.
It is, and it creates a more accepting and interesting world for everyone.
Absolutely. And that's something I think we could all use a little more of.
I agree.
So how do we start owning our freak flags?
Well, it starts with identifying those things about ourselves that we might be trying to suppress or hide, What are those things you love but feel self-conscious about?
Like a quirky hobby.
Yeah.
A weird fashion sense.
Anything. Those things that make you.
And then what?
And then you celebrate them. Don't be afraid to let your freak flag fly. Let the world see what makes you special.
I love that. Because honestly, the world needs more people who are willing to be themselves.
Absolutely. It makes life so much more colorful and exciting.
It's interesting because a lot of what Zander talks about in the book, it all ties back to this idea of taking ownership, of our thoughts, our actions, our past, our freak flags.
It's about becoming the author of our own story instead of letting other people write it for us.
Right. And realizing that we have more power than we think to create the life we want.
And that's a really empowering message, I think, especially in a world that often tells us who we should be and how we should live.
It's a reminder that we have a choice. We can choose to conform, or we can choose to be ourselves. And ultimately, choosing ourselves is what leads to true happiness and fulfillment.
I couldn't agree more. It's about living a life that is true to who we are, not who other people think we should be.
And that's a really beautiful thing.
It is.
There's a question at the end of the book that really stuck with me.
What is it?
It's, what one small promise can you make to yourself today to start living more authentically?
Oh, I like that. It's a simple question, but it's really powerful.
It is.
Yeah.
Because it's an invitation to take action, right? To start making those small changes that can lead to big transformations.
Exactly. It's not about overnight makeovers or trying to change everything at once.
It's about those little daily choices that over time add up to a life that is more aligned with who we truly are.
It's about being patient with ourselves and celebrating every step we take in the right direction.
And that's what I love about Zander's approach. It's not about perfection. It's about progress.
It's about embracing the journey and knowing that we're all works in progress.
And I think that's a really important message to remember, especially when it comes to personal growth. It's not a destination, it's a lifelong journey.
Absolutely. It's about continuously learning, growing, and evolving into the best versions of ourselves.
And that's something we can all strive for no matter where we are on our journey.
I agree.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up for today.
Sounds good to me.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Maybe It's You. We hope you found it helpful and inspiring.
Me too. And remember, even small steps can lead to big transformations. So start with one small promise to yourself today and see where it takes you.
Exactly. Until next time.
And that whole idea of taking ownership, well, it's really important when it comes to relationships too.
Oh, for sure. Especially when you start to think about all those unspoken expectations we bring into them, right?
Right. Zander calls these unspoken agreements relationship contracts.
Relationship contracts, okay.
Yeah. And it covers everything from chores around the house to money to how we show affection, all those unspoken things.
So basically, it's all the stuff we assume the other person just knows, even though we've never actually talked about it.
Exactly. And you can imagine how that can lead to problems, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's like a recipe for misunderstandings and resentment.
It is. And Zander highlights this with the example of Donna again, the woman who was struggling to define her ideal marriage.
Oh, right. Oh, no.
Oh, she had this whole laundry list of complaints about her husband, John.
A laundry list, huh?
Yeah, everything was on there. From his snoring to his lack of help around the house, it was pages long.
Yikes. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It kind of was, but I think we can all relate to that to some extent, right? Maybe not a literal list, but definitely those moments of wait, why don't you just get it?
Totally. It's so easy to fall into that trap of assuming our partner should just know what we're thinking or feeling.
Right. And Zander's point is that instead of stewing in resentment, we need to get those contracts out in the open.
Have an honest conversation about it.
Exactly. Not in a confrontational way, but just hey, here's what I'm expecting. Here's what I need. What about you?
Like a negotiation.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance that works for both people.
You mentioned in your notes that communication's been a big focus for you lately, right?
Yeah, it has.
I bet this idea of renegotiating relationship contracts can be really helpful for you, whether it's with your partner, family, or even colleagues at work.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
It's definitely something I'm going to be thinking about more.
But speaking of tough conversations, Zander doesn't shy away from the really deep stuff either.
What do you mean?
Well, she talks about how our past, those unresolved hurts and betrayals can create these hauntings that affect our lives even years later.
Hauntings, that's an interesting way to put it.
It is. And it's not just about setting boundaries or communicating better in the present. It's about addressing those deeper emotional wounds that might be holding us back.
Oh, I see. It's like those past experiences can create these patterns that keep repeating themselves.
Exactly. Like if you grew up with parents who were constantly fighting, you might find yourself unconsciously recreating that same dynamic in your own relationships.
Even if you don't want to.
Right. And Zander uses the example of Ethan, this guy who struggled to express his feelings and set boundaries.
Ethan. Okay.
So it turns out he grew up in a really volatile household, lots of yelling and arguing. And as a result, he learned to suppress his emotions and avoid confrontation at all costs.
And that carried over into his adult relationships, huh?
Yeah, it did. He'd just shut down whenever there was conflict.
It's amazing how powerful those early experiences can be, right?
It really is. But Zander offers this pretty intense tool for addressing those hauntings.
What is it?
It's called the parent letter.
Oh, wow, the parent letter. I've heard of that.
It sounds pretty heavy, right?
It can be, but it can also be incredibly healing.
So how does it work?
Well, basically, you write a letter to one or both of your parents, expressing everything you've never said to them, the hurts, the frustrations, the ways their actions impacted you.
Wow. So it's like getting it all out on paper.
Exactly. But Zander emphasizes that it's not about sending the letter or trying to make your parents feel guilty.
So you don't actually mail it?
No. It's really about the process of writing it. It's about understanding how your parents' actions shaped you, acknowledging the pain you experienced, and starting to heal those old wounds.
It's like taking back your power in a way, right?
Exactly. It's about releasing yourself from those old narratives that might be holding you back.
That's powerful stuff.
It is. And it might be something you revisit over time, as you continue to process and heal.
It makes sense. Those deep-seated patterns can take time to unravel.
They do. But the parent letter can be a really valuable tool for starting that process.
You mentioned earlier that you're working on setting better boundaries in your own life.
Yeah.
I bet this parent letter could be really helpful for exploring, where those boundary issues might stem from.
That's a good point. I'm definitely going to look into that.
I think it's so interesting how all these different tools and techniques, they all kind of connect back to that idea of taking ownership, of our thoughts, our feelings, our past, our present.
It's about becoming the conscious creators of our own lives instead of just reacting to whatever comes our way.
And realizing that we have more agency than we think.
Exactly. And that's a really empowering message, I think. It's about taking control of our lives and creating the reality we want instead of just letting life happen to us.
I love that. And I think it's a perfect segue into another concept that Zander talks about, owning our freak flags.
Oh, I love that one.
It's such a fun and liberating idea, right?
It is. It's about embracing those parts of ourselves that make us unique, maybe a little bit quirky or different, but ultimately what make us us.
Exactly. And instead of trying to fit in or be like everyone else, Zander encourages us to celebrate those differences, to let our freak flags fly.
Because those are the things that make us special. They're what make us stand out from the crowd.
And she argues that it's in those moments of embracing our true selves, even the parts we might feel self-conscious about, that we truly shine.
Because it's authentic, it's real, and people are drawn to that.
She tells this funny story about how she had feathers put in her hair for a festival, and then realized she had a fancy dinner party to go to that night with people she didn't know.
Oh, I remember that. She was worried about what people would think, right?
Totally. But instead of taking the feathers out, she decided to just own it.
Have it.
And people loved it. They were drawn to her confidence and her willingness to be herself.
That's such a great example of how trying to fit in or be someone we're not ultimately backfires.
It's when we let our freak flags fly that we truly connect with others.
It's like giving others permission to do the same, to embrace their own uniqueness.
A beautiful thing.
It really is. And it creates a more accepting and interesting world for everyone.
Absolutely. So how do we start owning our freak flags?
Well, I think it starts with identifying those things about ourselves that we might be trying to suppress or hide, What are those things you love but feel self-conscious about?
Could be anything, right? A quirky hobby, a weird fashion sense, an unusual taste in music.
Exactly. Anything that makes you feel a little bit different.
Okay, so we identify those things. Then what?
And then you celebrate them. Don't be afraid to let your freak flag fly. Let the world see what makes you special.
I love that. Because honestly, the world needs more people who are willing to be themselves, to embrace their individuality.
It makes life so much more colorful and exciting, don't you think?
Absolutely. So, I was thinking about all the different tools and strategies in the book, and there's one that I'm really excited to try out. It's the daily design. Have you ever used that?
Oh, the daily design, yeah. I have. It's really amazing, actually.
I've heard good things. I mean, the idea is so simple, but it seems really powerful.
It is. So the basic idea is that you plan out your ideal day in advance, kind of like you're writing a script for your best self.
Right, like setting intentions for work, relationships, your health, like all of it.
Yeah, all of it. But the key is, and this is the part that's kind of cool, you write it all in the past tense as if it's already happened.
So instead of saying, I will go for a run, you would say, I went for an amazing run this morning.
Exactly. And Zander says that shift in language is super important because it actually programs your subconscious mind for success.
Oh, interesting. Like you're already living that ideal day in your mind.
Yeah. And so then it becomes more likely to happen in reality.
It makes sense, but it's one of those things that you got to actually try to see if it works for you.
For sure. But it's not just about setting those intentions. You also reflect at the end of the day.
Like a debrief.
Yeah, exactly. You look back and see, okay, what did I accomplish? Where did I fall short?
So it's this constant loop of like intention, action, reflection.
Yes, exactly. And it helps you to course correct, make adjustments as you go.
I really like that. It's like you're constantly designing your life day by day.
Exactly. And that ties back to that whole theme of taking ownership.
Being the author of your own story.
Yes. And speaking of becoming the best versions of ourselves, Zander wraps up the book with this really powerful message about embracing our individuality.
Our freak flags.
Yeah. It's like after all this work we've done, confronting our lies and facing our fears, it's all about living authentically, showing up in the world as our true selves.
It's like the ultimate goal of personal growth.
I think so. And Zander makes this great point that owning our freak flags, it's not just about self-acceptance.
It's also about creating a more accepting world for everyone.
Exactly. It's about celebrating diversity and encouraging self-expression, challenging those societal norms that tell us we need to fit in.
Right. Like instead of trying to change ourselves to fit the mold, we break the mold.
Yes. And it starts with each of us embracing our own uniqueness.
Ooh. There's this question at the end of the book that really resonated with me. It's, what one small promise can you make to yourself today to start living more authentically?
Oh, that's a good one. It's simple, but it gets you thinking.
Yeah. And it's an invitation to take action. It doesn't have to be some big life-altering thing.
Right. It's about those small, consistent steps.
Because true transformation isn't about overnight makeovers. It's about those little daily choices that add up over time.
And having compassion for ourselves along the way. We're all going to mess up sometimes, but it's about getting back up and trying again.
Well said. It's a journey, not a destination.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And that's what makes it so exciting.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
I agree.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Maybe It's You. We hope you found it insightful and are feeling inspired to make some positive changes in your own life.
Me too. And remember, even small steps can lead to big transformations. So what's that one small promise you're going to make to yourself today? Think about it.
Until next time.